Okay, awesome. So now we're back. Now we're going to go jump into the data visualization integration into React. So for our data visualization library, we're going to be using D3, which stands for Data-Driven Documents. It's a powerful visualization library that allows you to create graphs for pretty much any kind of visualization that you're thinking of. So this can be box plots, bubble charts, bullet charts, sun diagrams, force charts, anything you can name, even tree maps, and you can implement it using D3. It's fairly extensive in the graphs that it represents. The the learning curve to D3 is relatively steep for beginners trying to get into the data visualization side, but we're going to go over this code and just kind of walk through step by step how we would implement our PDF graph. So what I went ahead and did is I've imported D3, so I've installed that as a package dependency. So if you wanted to install that into your project, you would say npm install D3 and save it into your package.json, and it will be there as a dependency. And if you look down here, you'll see that I've also imported an additional component. So prior to this, I've created a component called SVG graph. And this allows me to have a reusable component that allows me to render SVG elements and basically customize it for my specific use case. And right below that, we have our projections data, which is going to be a sample data that we'll use for Tom Brady to simulate his projections for this fantasy week. And then down here, we have our state variables we initialize to first use projection data and set it to null. This will be updated once we mount our SVG, which is based on our next flag, SVG mounted. So once we know that is rendered in the UI, then we'll have a callback function to essentially attach D3 to that specific SVG element. And these variables down here are all going to be related to D3 variables. So we have our x and y axes. We're going to have a function to visualize our graph. In this case, it's going to be the line function. We're going to, of course, set the width and height, and then we have our graph colors. So based upon the design, we have our red for the bust and blue for the boom and gray to show what's the range of expected projected values for Tom Brady. And then we're going to have like this vertical dotted line to show what exactly we predict Tom Brady to score for that given fantasy week. All right, cool. And then we have our callback function, which is going to be used by SVG graph. So whenever we mount it, then we're going to initiate this callback function, which will then begin the whole bootstrapping process of attaching D3 to the SVG element in the DOM. So let's go ahead and actually get into the SVG mount function. All right, so off top, we first use D3 to select the DOM element that we've recently rendered in our SVG graph, and it's going to assign that to a variable, which we'll call this.svg. We're going to set the bounds of the SVG container, so give it a width and height, and of course give it a little bit of padding and margin so it can fit within the bounds of the application. And then we're going to assign the line variable a D3 function, which is going to render our line graph that we'll use for our PDF chart. And then we're going to set up the X and Y axes. We're going to give it a range. We're going to tell our D3 application that this the data for X and Y axes should be scaled linearly so they fit within the context of our application and not display all wonky and out of place. Then we're going to format our axes to say, hey, we want for the x-axis is going to append a string of points at the end, and for the y-axis we're going to have a percentage to show the probability of that function. And when all that is done, then we're going to set a flag, and our state, our local state, to SVG mounted to be true. So we've bootstrapped everything and we're good to go. And when that is set in our component did update function, we're going to do a check to see, hey, do we have that information? So when we run into the initial component did update, it's going to do a check to say, hey, do we have our mounted flat set to true, and do we also have our projection data? In this case, we haven't set our projection data yet, so what we'll do is first set our projection data to a data that we fetched here at the top, the sample data, and then we're going to update the local state of our PDF graph to reflect the latest changes in projection data. And then we'll get to this if statement, which will then allow us to generate the graph data, which will then present a graph in the UI. So when we jump into generate graph data, so the convention using D3, whenever you are writing any kind of application using D3, is to start off with removing any kind of elements, any residual elements over in your D3 application. This is good for whenever you're doing updates. Let's say for our application, whenever you select another player, we go into the multiple player view. We want to render this graph again, but before we do that, we should wipe it clean and then re-render it. So this is a convention that D3 uses. In our example here, we don't necessarily have to do this because there's not going to be any updates for this demonstration, but just so you guys are aware of the convention, I'm going to leave that in there so we can be aware of what needs to be done. From there, we then attach to the SVG element, and we begin appending additional children elements to the SVG DOM or HTML element. And this is going to be for the x-axis, the y-axis, adding custom classes for each one of these axes. And then this is where we start to manipulate the data to show it in our D3 graph. We do an initial check to make sure that we have the projection data. If not, then we're not going to render anything on the graph. But we take the data and we do some massaging and a little bit of manipulation to the data just to kind of replace any funky values and anything that could potentially break the graph. One thing to note as well, this file, and I can actually open that up for you guys so you can see what it looks like. Projection. This file is pretty comprehensive in its score simulation, so we're going to be using the score distribution portion to render our graph. And as you can see here, there are a lot of data points to render. Naturally, if I try to take all that data and render it in D3, it's going to come across very pixelated. So one of the things that I've worked on and came up to a conclusion is to condense a lot of this data into from, like, let's say 1,000 points to more like 120 data points, just by computing an average distribution across the various probabilities, so that when we render it in our UI, it's not as pixelated, it's very smooth. So that's what this is doing right here. And then we're of course fetching out the values for projected high, projected low, the mid-range. That way we can have in our UI references to where these data points begin, where they end, and so on. And then we're going to take that data and we're going to start appending them into the SVG element itself. So the first one here is going to be a path. So this is going to show us like the line graph for what we expect to be the mid-range for Tom Brady. So in this case here, it's going to be this gray area. All right, and here we can add, customize the various attributes. We can give it a class name. We can say what color of the stroke that we want to use for this SVG element. We can say what's the opacity, how thick do we want the lines. There's a lot of customization that you can do to the specific elements within your SVG. And we're going to do the same thing for the minimum projection. So that goes back to this red section here. And this is just to keep in mind, it's just only referring to the line graph. Now we have to create a separate element for the dot, and we'll get to that later, but this is right now just pertaining to the line section here. And the same thing for the max projections. It's going to refer to this blue line here. And then we're going to start adding the dots in. This one's going to be for the minimal, the bust area of the PDF graph. So we're going to append the dot to our SVG. And this line is going to associate with what we project Tom Brady to score for that given week. So if you look back in the design, you can see there's like a dotted line that goes vertically through the graph. This point is to touch on where we project Tom Brady to have to score for that specific week. So this is demonstrating how to do that as well. This has additional attributes where you have the x1, y1, and y2 to give you the starting point and the ending points for this vertical line. And then we're going to add, of course, the dot for the boom section so this blue dot here would be for that. So once we have that all rendered out and saved, then we should be able to render our graph, and it should show up in the browser. So let us pull up our page, make sure it's saved. And awesome, we're able to display this information. So we have our bus section here. We have the range for our expected projections. We have the vertical dotted line to show us what we expect for him to score actually. And then we have the section here for the boom. So it renders nicely. It looks really good. And we have our first data D3 graph and integration into React. So now the next step and final step will be to style this component or style this application to make it look more like the demo or the design. So I'll see you guys on the next video.